Hello, nerds. Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Today we have author Paul Craddock and his book, Spare Parts, about the history of transplants. Had a lot of fun talking to Paul. He's a really fun guy. Absolutely love the book. It's really interesting. I'm generally not into medicine and stuff like that, but he made this a really, really enjoyable book. Highly recommend it. Paul's a lot of fun to talk to, which means I'm going to shut up and let's just get to it. Here he is, Paul Craddock. All right, here we are with Paul Craddock, author of Spare Parts. Paul, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Paul, you have written one of the most both disgusting and interesting books that I have read in a long time, Spare Parts, History of Transplants.
You're very kind.
How did you even come up with the idea for this? Because it's big, it's really interesting, but how did you even come up with, I can do this and not write a 1,000-page book?
Oh, well, it could be a fairly long story, but I'll go for the shorter version. I knew I was going to do a PhD in something humanities-based, something arts-based. I was accepted on a PhD program in London, and I wasn't quite sure what my subject was going to be. And I was searching the internet for inspiration, and I came across a photograph of a student called Jennifer Sutton. And what was remarkable about this photograph is that she was staring at her own dead heart. So it was in a museum. And what had happened is Jennifer had a condition called cardiomyopathy, and that basically means that the walls of her heart are thicker than they should have been, and the blood can't pump around the body very well. And the only cure for that is a transplant. And she had that transplant, and a new at the time medical museum at the Wellcome collection, they asked if they could have her old heart as an exhibit. So it was their first public exhibition, Cold Heart, and she agreed, and it was there, and there was a photographer to sort of capture that moment of her encountering her own heart. If you search the words Jennifer Sutton and heart, just Google them, you'll see it. And basically that captivated me. It changed the direction of my research. It sort of channeled it into transplant surgery immediately because, it was a very intimate photograph. You can't get much more intimate, can you, than a woman staring at her own heart. And if you think about the implications of that, it raises questions about our individual identity, our identity as humans as well. What does it mean to have a body? What does it mean to be an individual? Are you an individual if you can accept parts from other people's bodies? And what does it mean to be alive if the organ that is responsible for your life, at least in many cultures, that's what people have believed about the heart, it is the vital organ. How can you be alive if you're also looking at your own heart? So it sort of sent shivers down my spine, and I thought, well, that's the subject I'm going to study. And I've been studying it now for 12 years. PhD, I did that a while ago, but that's finished.
I was about to say, you're not done yet? Come on, you should be there. Well, I'll be honest with you, I generally, a lot of times medical stuff, I'm just not into it, right? History can be very personal about what you want to read. But
it can be very boring too, actually.
It really can be. Thank God yours wasn't. You had me at, hey, by the way, people used to cut off noses, and they figured out you can regrow a nose by just stitching your arm to your face. And I went, oh, this is going to be a weird and wonderful adventure. That's the very beginning of the book. What made you say, right, you really kind of start off with that and just kind of basically when people started asking these questions, how did you decide what was going to make it into the book and not, right? Because transplants takes in account a lot of stuff. How did you whittle it down and say this was going to be kind of my through line?
There's a lot of the history of medicine that you could possibly cover, but when it comes to transplant surgery, practically there isn't very much happening before 1900. But what is happening is absolutely fascinating and is a window on a different kind of story. In other words, it's a window on the story of identity. So what made it into the book is really what tells us about our changing ideas of identity and what moving body parts around has meant for different people in different moments in history. The story starts, as you pointed out, in Renaissance Italy. So that's 1549. But that's when transplant surgery starts to become part of the history of modern medicine. But it's actually a much, much older procedure. It's first mentioned in the Sushruta Samhita, which is an ancient Ayurvedic surgical text from India. So that was written sometime between 600 and 200 BC. And what's remarkable about that is that even then, back then, those procedures in that text were considered traditional. So it goes back much, much further, and that procedure seems to come from horticulture. So you sort of start with this idea of this connection between humans and plants. So there's also a lot of cultures right up until the Renaissance really, really identified people with plants. In India, people married plants to sanctify their crops. We as in humans, have in the past set trees on fire to have some kind of magical influence because there's a connection between human bodies and tree bodies. Even in ancient Greece and Rome, thinkers like Pliny the Elder have pointed out that there are physiological similarities between plants and trees. And really, transplant surgery is an extension of that connection between humans and plant life. We, as humans, our bodies in some very important and fundamental ways behave in the same way as trees. So you have another kind of relationship between body parts and identity emerging in the 17th century with blood transfusions. Well, I should mention first, actually, that blood transfusions happened first, not between two humans. It wouldn't work because you don't know what's in the blood. And people thought it inside was some kind of soul or personality. And it was thought that it would be a diabolical thing to start pouring one human into another, which it would be in a way. But what you could do is you could use the blood of animals to treat human diseases. If you had a mad person, someone who was insane, they'd obviously be quite erratic. So you'd want to counter that with the blood of a lamb. Of course, it's Christ's lamb, isn't it? They're reputedly calm as well, but if you've ever tried to hold a lamb, you'll find out that they're not calm. They run away.
A lot of the olden times, people are amazingly literal about things. Lamb of God must mean they're nice. We can take their blood. It should be fine. It'll make us feel better.
Well, Brendan, the amazing thing is that it worked, or it seemed to work, because they also weren't very good at transfusing blood physically.
Listen, you slow play that too, because there's at least 20 or 30 pages where they're doing these first transfusions with animals, and I'm like, why aren't they dead? They should be dead. They should be dead. And you just kind of slow play like, oh, it's because they kind of suck at this.
Well, it's suspense, Brendan. It's suspense. It's suspense. I'm trying to build suspense. Yeah, it didn't work because you can even if it was a little bit successful, and there is evidence to suggest that at times it was successful. You could actually take the blood from one animal and put it into a human. Even if that was a bit successful, you wouldn't necessarily die. You'd have a fit and you'd be very unwell, but that would also mean you're worn out. You're very tired. You can't act mad anymore. You can't be erratic so it looks like it's cured you. And then finally you come around and eventually you start behaving erratically again because it hasn't really cured you. But then you need a top-up. And eventually you'll die. I mean, that's not necessarily funny. It's a funny situation to think about.
It's a little bit of both, too, because in the beginning you see these things that are so outlandish, but of course, at the same time, these are, pathfinders in the way of medicine. But one thing I want to really touch on at the beginning of the book, because I think you handle this really well, a lot of animals are having a bad day here, right? And of course... Back then,
understatement.
Yes, back then, we don't look at animals the way we look at now, about, being humane and things like that. So you have to balance as the author. The dogs are what got to me. That was a rough one. How do you as an author write this, right? You're writing, hey, these are pathfinders. These are mainly men who have pushed things along so that we can do what we do today, which is so important. But at the same time, they're torturing animals, and they're just not even thinking about it. It's tough to write about those people in a proper context nowadays because people will automatically say, you're hurting a goat, man, cut it out. How do you write that?
Well, first I should say that people in those days did object to harming animals. There was always a debate about that. The difficulty actually comes when I'm not trying to build heroes here. These people are flawed. And I think, actually, frankly, I think what some people have called the scientific gaze encourages certain flaws. And one of those is a sort of dispassionate interest in things like animal life. You can't say science causes a dispassionate sort of uncaring attitude towards animal life, actually. I mean, Robin Wall Kimmerer's wonderful book called Braiding Sweetgrass really is about that, the potential of a caring and environmentally and humane approach to science. But these people didn't have. What's really difficult to reconcile, I suppose, is that undeniable benefit of medical experiments on animals and the heartlessness that seems to go with a lot of these advances and the people that made them. So that's difficult for me emotionally to write because I am an animal lover.
And I mean, you talking about flawed people might be an understatement. At the same time that some of these people could be deemed brilliant, right? With the way that they started to go against the grain, started thinking about things differently. They are also straight up crackpots. They were also just, and thank God doctors aren't like this anymore, had huge egos and were constantly trying to one-up each other.
You say doctors aren't like that anymore, but I can give you a few names.
Oh, that was sarcasm. That was good American sarcasm.
Well, it's difficult to put it all out there, actually. And this sort of touches on a book that I'm writing the proposal for at the moment, actually. Because in researching, especially the 17th century, but later as well, you find that the stories that we're told about these people, Robert Boyle, for instance, the famous scientist everybody's heard of, Isaac Newton, he's not in this first book, I don't think, but he's another example. Those core figures of science, everybody learns a little bit about in school, and we all sort of know their story, but actually, if you scratch beneath the surface, you find out that a lot of the science was done by working class or proto-working class people, by women. Because of the way natural philosophy was forming at that time, you had labs emerging, you had workshops finding an identity, and they would employ people to do a good deal of the science, in some cases to actually come up with the theories. And then that would be claimed by people like Robert Boyle because they paid the wage. They're certainly not the lone geniuses that they have been painted out to be.
Some of them had just very out there ideas that, right, some of them would work out. And then not all of these ideas bore out. It's very interesting, right, that they can be so innovative about one thing and then so far off about other things. Well, and that's another part of the book, right, is that it took a while before they said, we need evidence.
That's why transplant surgery seems to be quite popular amongst the peasants, actually, in the 16th century. And that's because, as a crackpot theory, the main theory that all of medical treatment was all legitimate, a university-backed medical treatment was based on until at least the 18th century. But transplant surgery initially wasn't like that. It was based on farming methods. So it was very, very sensible, actually. When you start getting blood transfusions in the 17th century, that's when you start getting these weird to us ideas, about what the blood could possibly do. Could it make you younger? Could it make an insane person sane? So that is the weirdest era, is when you get that, that idea that we have circulatory systems. We have, we've recognized by the early 17th century that at least a bit of our body can be seen as a machine. That's the heart of a circulatory system. But we don't know what the blood is, so we'll just look at this crackpot stuff, as you described it. I'm not sure they would use that term. We'd just look at that stuff to sort of think what could possibly be the value of moving blood from one system to another. So you have that very interesting time where you have old coming up against new.
There's a ton of wild stuff in here. Was there anything that you came across and you said, wow, this is insane. I've never even heard this myself before?
Yeah. My PhD was in 18th century transplant surgery, so it's quite narrow, as PhDs are. And this book is barely related to the PhD. It is only related in subject, because, of course, a PhD is a technical document. It's for scholarly use. But this is a story. This is for people to read and enjoy. And it's well researched, obviously, because it's backed up by the PhD, etc. The thing that was wildest for me was the use of a spinach leaf as a scaffold for human heart tissue. And that's something that's happening now in Worcester Polytechnic Institute and Harvard, actually. And that's wild to me because I started the story by writing about the connection between transplant surgery and farming. So you have this sort of natural, sort of plant-informed way of thinking about transactions between bodies, connecting them together. But the story also ends with a quite similar theme. If you've got spinach leaves, you're using the actual internal structure of that spinach leaf in a human. So it's a kind of beautiful circle in a way. You go from a horticultural, agricultural understanding of the body to another sort of horticultural, agricultural understanding of the body in transplant. And that's very beautiful to me, but it also blows my mind that transplants are still influenced by that physiological connection between people and plants. I should have mentioned this earlier, but in the 16th century, skin grafting was considered so close to plant grafting that the doctors who wrote it up and the surgeons who wrote it up referred to it as the agriculture of the body and the farming of men.
Also along that lines, your book made me just think about this, and I remember going out and looking. Leeches and maggots are still, at least in the States, approved medical treatments, right?
Yeah, of course.
We're talking about 100 leeches have been the thing. Now they've been horribly misused, but just like you're talking about with the spinach leaf, that connection with nature in a lot of different ways, that a leech or a maggot can do the job at least the same, if not better, than everything we've been able to come up with all of these advances, that there's such a strong connection, that there still is, that this is not completely broken by things that we can make in a lab, that sometimes what's already out there is what's best for us than anything else.
Now, I'm not an expert in this area, but I heard yesterday that scientists have created a kind of miniature bubble that can be injected into the bloodstream made of pretty much of olive oil. It might be more complex than that, actually. That might have been just a way that the scientist was explaining it to her audience. Basically, you can put cancer drugs into a bubble made of olive oil. It can be released by firing ultrasound when it reaches the tumor. So amazing. I mean, olive oil.
It's absolutely crazy. Well, speaking of crazy, let's actually go over to gross a little bit. Was there anything in your research that you saw and said, oh, this could kind of fit in the book, but this is so gross, people will close the book and walk away?
In a word, no. You won't believe this probably, but I don't really go for gross. I've got a responsibility as a writer, I feel, to bring the world to life. And if that world is unpalatable, I think that's an important historical consideration. I prefer prose to be as direct as possible, and I prefer it to be evocative. So the gross factor doesn't really come into it.
Let's completely switch. Is there a subject of the book that you admired the most? A specific person that you think is really kind of a highlight and maybe somebody a little bit overlooked by the medical community?
Yes. The person would be Marianne Leroudier, and she was a 19th century seamstress in Lyon in France. She sort of quietly and even unknowingly created the possibility that organs can be sewn into bodies. And she did that completely without knowing she did that. She taught a surgeon called Alexis Carrel. And Alexis Carrel actually got a Nobel Prize for his technique to sew organs into bodies. To sew blood vessels together, which is pretty much the same thing. And Marianne Leroudier was his teacher. In the 19th century, early 20th century, when this took place, you would, as a surgeon, usually learn to sew from your mother or your sister or your wife or some other, domestic female relative. That would be enough for most surgery at the time. It's quite brutal, quite basic, quite simple. Carrel wanted to sew blood vessels together. So he sought a different kind of tutor, and because his parents owned textile factories, so he was sort of in the field in a way anyway. But he came across this woman called Marianne Leroudier, and she was a very famous French embroiderer. She had and very accomplished. She'd embroidered the gold thread on the curtains of the Opera House in Paris. The Vatican owns some of her work. She's top notch. And so my question was, what could she have taught Carrel that he couldn't have learned from a domestic seamstress? I work with a seamstress, an embroiderer here, one of the best embroiderers in this country, called Fleur Oakes. And we reenacted Carrel's technique. We looked at and we unpicked Leroudier's pieces in the museum in Lyon. And we came up with actually some very, very specific techniques that are very difficult to express in writing or in speech, but you have to see what the embroiderer is doing. But we unpicked that and we looked at those differences, and I came to the conclusion that Leroudier did contribute some, I suppose the technical term is embodied knowledge to this technique, and therefore the science of organ transplants is at least partly based on 19th century French embroidery. And I admire Leroudier so much, not because she is a hero. I try to stay clear of making heroes of any of the people I write about anyway, but I think because she represents so many people who have contributed to science in the past through their craft, through making things, through doing things. So I admire that quiet revolutionary moment. And I think that it appeals to the Englishman in me. This sort of, let's not make a fuss.
I love that line, and I know you just said it's kind of difficult. It's hard in my mind to picture what we're talking about. Is it that she could just stitch it really finely, or was it the actual pattern, the way she embroidered? Is there a non-visual way to kind of explain how different it is?
There are certain aspects of a seamstress's or an embroiderer's craft that are not in the technical skill set of a domestic seamstress. And they are things that we found evidence of in Carrel's technique. So they must have come from Leroudier. And they're things like being able to work one-handed. Mm-hmm. So a domestic seamstress would generally have to put their hand behind the thing they're working on to steady themselves. They're things like working without a warp and a weft. So working on fabrics that tear easily. So one of the things that Carrel practiced on, probably, although there's no reference to why he started practicing on it. It probably came from Leroudier. He practiced on a cigarette paper, and he could fit 500 side-by-side stitches into that space. Incidentally, Fleur, who's the embroiderer I worked with, can fit 600, but she's, one of the world's best, so you'd expect that. But that's another set of skills that are involved with sewing into arteries, particularly, which resemble cigarette papers in material integrity. If you make a mistake, and it's easy to make a mistake, you tear the vessel, and it's very hard to recover from that. So there are things associated with that. There are things associated with making the thread go on the outside of a vessel. So I mentioned the gold embroidery, the gold lace embroidery on the opera curtains in the Paris Opera House. Well, there are special techniques involved in making sure that expensive gold thread goes on the outside so people can see it, and you're not wasting the money. Well, those techniques were also used in vascular anastomosis, it's called, sewing together blood vessels, to keep the thread where you want it. So there are a few very, very technical and specialist aspects to embroidery and sewing that it's unlikely he would have got from elsewhere.
And you've already mentioned, talking about Leroudier, there's a lot of people who don't get the credit that they deserve here. I mean, you're talking about before, we're writing things down extensively and things like that. But even recently, and I mentioned this before, there was that rush, especially towards the end of the book when you're starting to get to first transplants. And you point this out, it got dangerous. Sure, it was about the science, but it was also about ego and being the first one to do something. I mean, when you read that, it's got to make you a bit kind of nervous, right? Looking at medical history, when doctors start to get a little bit ahead of themselves, it's probably good to have that competition to push them forward. But at the same time, when does that become dangerous because you're doing it for your ego as opposed to for the patient?
Two things, really, in answer to that. First, that's why we have things like the Human Tissue Authority. We have bodies and ethics committees dedicated to making sure that scientists and doctors play safe and play fair. I think nowadays medical education really addresses things like ethics, and you find that doctors these days and surgeons are on the whole incredibly sensible and aware of the responsibilities that they have, which has not been the case in the past. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we've also got to be careful about these stories. And this is why I found it difficult to write about organ transplants in an even-handed way. And that's because a lot of this happened in the 60s, and the cultural context there is very different to anything that came before. We'd just really come out of a devastating Second World War. People really responded well to stories of optimism. Also, and related to this, hospitals and individual doctors at that moment in history, public relations became a big thing. And they started to understand the value. It's not a cynical thing to say that. They started to understand the value of presenting themselves in a particular way. So these stories that we are fed, and to some extent I've regurgitated, but I've tried to be a bit more critical with them. To some extent, those stories are crafted to appeal to a population that really worships heroes. And I suppose one of the reasons that transplant surgery needs to be revisited now, and one of the reasons I've revisited organ transplants now as well as every other kind of transplant, is that for me and my generation, I'm 37. I came to a sort of adulthood and responsibility in the wake, more or less, of a financial crash. I have never known that world of optimism. I've never really felt this optimism. And I don't identify with these heroic surgeons. I don't want to hero worship. I sort of feel that I and my generation, your generation too, you're a similar age to me. I think that we need different stories, and to find the significance of these scientific and surgical and medical advances, I think we need to arrive at our own conclusions and not regurgitate the hero worshipping stories that are written about these people. Now, it's one of the few places, actually, transplant surgery. It's one of the few specialisms, even, that people still worship heroes like Christian Bernard. Any other medical specialism, more or less, and certainly most of science writing has learned in the last 30 years that that's not really the way to do it. But it's, for some reason, transplant surgery still inspires this hero worship. And I think it's probably to do with the fact that it's so emotionally charged, and you are unambiguously saving lives in a very dramatic way. And it invites these sort of hero stories.
And especially with transplants, what I think is, piggybacking off what you said, if you're getting a transplant, it means you need it or you're probably going to die, right? Unless we're talking about plastic surgery or something like that. But if you need liver, if you need heart, you need lungs, like, it means it's over unless they do something. And you are just so very literally saving a life by doing it unambiguously, as you mentioned.
But you're also not taking life, but you're also enacting a kind of tragedy. You're part of a kind of tragedy in the end of someone else's life.
That's deep. It's deep and that's heavy.
It is, and it's a compelling story.
Well, speaking of compelling story, one of the reasons we have History of Nerds United is to bring these stories and show people, hey, history isn't boring. It can be pretty exciting. If you ran to one of those people, it's like, history is boring, I'm not going to waste my time on that. Why would you say, read Spare Parts, this is going to change your mind?
Spare Parts, it's not a chore to read. It's a story. It's not a piece of academic history. So I've written it to be engaging. It's about our bodies and how moving bits of them around has in the past helped us think about our identity as humans as well as individuals. If there's one big question that this book addresses, it's the question, what does it mean to be inside a body, to be a body, to be a human, to be an individual? It's a question that concerns us all, and we all think about in some way or another. Transplant surgery has been one of the major ways that people have come to terms with or comprehended or thought about their relationships with their bodies for at least 500 years. And that's well documented. And it's a story that's not been told before because people think about transplant surgery as this 1950s, 1960s super advanced medicine, but it's not. It's fundamental to what humans do. And that's the story I'm telling.
Well, listen, Paul, the book is Spare Parts. I absolutely loved it. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you so much, Brendan. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And that's it for this episode. Thank you, Paul, for coming on. Everybody head on out to social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, wherever you can find us. Please listen to the podcast, review the website, put up reviews of the episodes, tell us what we're doing well, email us, whatever you can do just to show your support. We really appreciate it, nerds. Until next time, bye.